Hi everyone and welcome to week 2. As the title suggests, we're going to be building on the previous week and talk more about shapes and how we can use it in order to generate drawings, paintings, and how it applies to design in general. Often, our artistic training usually takes us to learning form and how to make things look three-dimensional really early. However, there are still plenty of things in the 2D realm that get overlooked and can make a large difference on the final result and execution of an image. So for this week, we'll be going over how to take complex subjects and break them down into simpler shapes so they can be approached a lot easier. We'll also be learning how to measure using our eyes on how to get a more sound picture. At the end of the chapter, we'll be doing a short exercise on design and editing based on the shapes we've taken from our subjects. Lastly, there will be a few beginner Photoshop lessons again for those who want to continue learning the digital medium. So I hope you're excited, as there's going to be plenty of drawing this week as we continue to build off of last week's lessons. Chapter 1: Shapes and Proportions. For this first section, we'll be warming up by breaking down some photographs and turning objects into simpler shapes. I have provided these photos in the class resource section in order to help you get started on the assignment. Now, this assignment is flexible enough that you can either use traditional media or jump straight into Photoshop. If you are using traditional media, you'll just need the same materials like we used from week 1, and as well as some tracing paper. Or if you happen to have some sort of light box, you can use that as well as a substitute. Lastly, you'll need to print out the images you're going to be using for this traceover exercise. I would like you all to set up your own still life by using objects that you can find around your home. When you do this, however, I would advise to use items like cups, fruit, bottles, any kind of container or box, and other objects that are fairly simple in shape and form. As for printing these, they can be in black and white in order to save some ink. You can either fill up the page with one image or do a half page like this in order to save some materials. However, I wouldn't go smaller than this. When you have the paper set up, start off by tracing the frame around the image, like so. Just a tip, it helps to put a bit of tape to keep the pages from sliding around. Before we get into the shapes, just remember to stick to simple shapes and lines as we did in week 1, just like the square, circle, and triangle, and all the other shapes that we've kind of combined from the exercises. Notice here, I'm going to start off by dotting off certain sections of an object in order to draw my lines. So what we're doing is we're pretty much just building up those good drawing habits from last week. So I'll mark these points off here so I can find my curves. Try not to blaze through this, and make sure you take your time in thinking about what shapes and lines to use. Remember, the point of this exercise is to find efficient ways in order to make complex subjects or complex scenes and try and find ways to simplify them. Just like last week, you can also draw in a circle using last week's exercise of following through. After that, you can follow up by refining those edges and getting those curves a little more accurate. Moving on to that box, again, just dotting off the corners in order to get those straight lines true. So again, you could dot off these lines and just even warm up on the side of the page as needed. Turn your page as needed in order to get those lines as true as you can. From here, I'm going to move on to the shadows because those are going to be important shapes as well in the composition. Usually they're a mixture of straight lines and curves, depending on the object that's casting them. Now there is a big line I missed in here. So in the still life, there's that dividing line of the table to the background. And that's a really important part of the still life. So marking off the background, that line will pretty much go through all the way through all these objects, which separates the table that it's on top of. So make sure you draw through instead of just trying to get section by section. That way you'll get a better connecting line that shows all the way through. And then getting the shadow of this ball here. And from there, I pretty much got all the shapes I need in order to complete this still life. From here, you could kind of break it down a little bit more. So you can connect some straight lines that have on these cylinders and cones, just so I can make it more of a triangle and a rectangle for the shapes. From there, you can remove the image underneath and just kind of double check what you have so far. Now from here, this is pretty much all you need in order to call this done. As long as you have the simple square, circles, and triangles, and not getting anything too complex, this part of the exercise can be finished. Here's a quick look at the finished traceover, as well as the photograph next to the drawing itself. Now, the more complex your subject, you'll most likely end up with more shapes. I'll be reviewing to see how well you simplify the image and the integrity of the shapes you've been using. You can do this assignment all in pencil or any of the traditional media we've gone over since week 1, but just as promised, I'll be doing a few more demonstrations in Photoshop to open up some options for you all. I'll also be going over on how to approach more complex subjects in the following demos. Chapter 1 continued, working digitally. Now that we're in Photoshop, we're going to do the same thing as we did with the tracing paper and draw over our photos in order to break them down into simple shapes. Now, to get started, I'm going to open up a new file, and it's going to be the same size as last week, where it was 1920 by 1080 with a 72 as the resolution, pixels per inch. Hit create. Okay, so last week we talked about the overall workspace of Photoshop, as well as a little introduction to the layers system. And hopefully by now you've gotten comfortable using the layers and moving out the images and photographs for the collage. But today we're going to be talking about a new tool because we're actually going to be drawing. So on the left side on the tools panel, we're also going to be using the brush tool. Now, if you right click as I did here, you're going to find different subcategories for this tool. For now, you just want to make sure it's on the brush tool. These other mixer brush and color replacement, it's more for photo retouching, so we only care about this one. Now, the other things that we want to learn about are these other window panels. So we had the layers open, And now we're also going to be using the brush panel as it's open here. Now this one usually comes with the brush presets tab, and the difference is the brush presets have a certain amount of options for these brushes that already have a certain setting. And in terms of the brush here, you can change the shapes of each brush. And right now I'm just going to be using a very Photoshop standard, which is the round shape brush. But I will also start to add a bit of shape dynamics and transfer. So just a quick overview, especially for those of you that are new to Photoshop. So the brush tip shape, if I turn these options off, so from here, we're basically just going to be left with the actual shape of the brush. And when we do a stroke on it and start to draw some lines, it'll be nice and even. So all these properties are off, and it'll be just a very solid looking line. Now, as soon as I turn on some options, such as shape dynamics, which I really like, this will change the size as you go along. Now, in terms of control, you do have to activate it. I like to set it on pen pressure. Now for this, it's going to be very similar to a brush or a pencil or even a marker, where the harder you press, the larger and thicker the line gets. So if I press really light, it'll be nice and thin. If I press harder, it'll be, a lot thicker to the actual size of the brush. Now this is really handy when it comes to getting some nice line quality. So it's a really flexible option here. The other thing I like to play around with is the transfer or opacity option. I also like to set this on pen pressure. And just like a pencil, if you press lightly, it'll be nice and light. If you press harder, it'll be darker. So try to play around with different options and see what are the best. And if you actually find a set of options that you really enjoy with your brush, you can simply open this little panel here and you could actually save it. So this could be the hard round brush, version 5. Hit OK. And that'll be saved in your brush presets. And it normally would save it under the very bottom of the list. Okay. So very useful to have. Besides making marks with our brush, we're of course going to need to erase them as we make mistakes. So from here, there is an eraser tool, just a few links down from the brush, and you want to have it on the standard eraser tool. So this one acts like a brush as well, just in reverse. This also shares the same shapes as the brushes here. So just this eraser is just a standard round brush, which I can use to erase the marks I made. Pretty straightforward, and it comes in handy when you need a different shape depending on what you're trying to erase. Now, besides the layers and brushes that we're going to use, we'll also need to change the color and value of the marks we're actually going to try to make. So under the Windows tab, you could find the color panel, or you could use the F6 shortcut to open up the window. Now here, the most standard way of picking colors for us concept artists is usually the HSB sliders. And it's pretty straightforward, where the H stands for hue, S is for saturation, and B for brightness. Now for most of our purposes when we're drawing, we'll just need a black and white image. We can turn the saturation all the way down. So regardless of the color that's actually being chosen, it's only going to be black and white. So based on the brightness, it could be light to dark, and everything in between. Now that we've gotten that mini Photoshop lesson out of the way, we can finally get back into it and start drawing again. So here I've gone ahead and placed in my photograph of the still life that I'm going to be breaking down. So from here the contrast is still really high, and any kind of drawing I do on top might get lost within the photograph. So what I need to do is check out the layer properties. So while selecting the layer that includes this image, I'm going to head over to opacity and bring it down to about 55 or 60%. And this should be light enough to where I can draw on top of it, just like tracing paper, and get some nice clean drawing on top that's easy to see. All right. You can experiment to see what works best for your photograph. Your mileage may vary, but for this one, I think about 50% to 60 works best. I'm also going to put another layer and rename it for, I'm going to rename it just to stay organized. All right. Now from here, just going to do the usual thing where I can pick my brush preset. I'm going to go with one of my drawing tools. And for the color, I can just keep it dark for now. Now if you need to change the size of your brush, you can do so up here, changing the size. Or if you have a shortcut, you can just use the open and close brackets to increase the size of your brush. All right, so first step would be to mark in the border. And just like the previous lesson, we're going to turn this into simple shapes, starting with the large ones if we can. So from here, we've got the circle. And then from here, I'm going to mark off, even if I can't see the rest of the cone, I'm going to try to mark it off and just draw the triangle that's in there. Now with Photoshop, you'll notice that it might be harder to draw these longer lines, especially if you're not turning the canvas. There is an option to turn it around, but the best you can, just try to mark off these simple shapes. So for this one, I'm going to keep it on the straight lines, marking off the dots and just drawing accordingly. Okay. Now there is a lot of detail in the background, but I'm going to ignore all that, and I'm just going to get the main parts of the cloth with the table that it's on. From here, the shadows are also a shape itself. So that is something I do want to mark off. This one over here, it's a longer shadow. And over here, we have the shadow of the cube. Okay. Now the neat thing about layers is you can turn them off and on. So there's this little eye symbol next to each layer. And if you turn this one off, you can see just your line work on top and see how well you did on the breakdown. Okay. Before I move on to another image, I'm going to go ahead and color code my shapes just to get in the habit of categorizing my priorities. So creating a new layer here, and off to the color picker or the swatches, I can start to choose what colors I want to use. And in general, just use something that's easy to see. So for the first one, I'll use red. And this could be my large shapes. Mediums could be blue. And then perhaps green for my small shapes. Another neat tool to learn is also the eyedropper tool. So over here, or for me it's I for the shortcut. And whatever color you touch with the eyedropper tool, that's the color that will be chosen. So this will be for my medium shapes. Alright, so from here, I'm going to take my largest shape, which is actually the cloth that it's on top of for the still life. Moving on to my medium shapes, it would be this part of the cube. Now the reason I'm not drawing the lines inside, again, I'm just trying to keep it in the 2D realm and not drawing forms yet. Okay, so I got my medium shape. This one has the same amount of mass. So I'm going to go ahead and draw the triangle and classify it as a medium shape. And so is this circle. Okay, and then from there, I would classify the shadows as my small shapes. Okay. And then from there, I have my 3 layers. And what you can do is, instead of starting a new file, you can always combine them together. One thing I like to do is select all 3 layers. So I'm going to hold Shift and highlight all 3 layers for this image. And I'm going to stick them in a folder. So you'll see a folder symbol at the bottom here, create new group. And that'll be classified as group 1. So they'll kind of stay together. And if you decide to turn them off and on, you can work on a new group with a different set of images. And instead of trying to resize each and every single layer to try to get them to match, when you have them in a group, when they're all selected like this, you can easily size them around and just save it for your homework presentation. For this next demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and do something a little bit more complex. So here we have an image of a landscape. This is basically just a photograph I took many years ago on a little mini trip. So from here, we definitely have a lot more going on, but we're still going to treat it the same way by breaking down these simple shapes. So we'll go ahead and set up the file. Make sure that the proportions are correct. Make it large enough so it's easier for us to draw. Just like the other one, just change the opacity lower and we'll get to drawing. Again, it's really important to just get in the habit of drawing the border in first. It is definitely an important aspect for our designs and just image making overall. All right, so usually trying to pick what the largest shapes would be, I usually try to find what's easier to draw, like what's more apparent from here. And just like week one, I'm dotting things off so it's easier for me to connect the lines. I don't want to be trying to sketch, sketch every single little detail in there like this. So I want to build off from what we learned last week and just kind of mark things off, dot them off, and connect the lines. It doesn't have to be super accurate like you see here. It's all about trying to get that true mark. Okay, from here we also have this long pole. For those of you that are doing this both traditionally and digitally, you'll notice the pros and cons of each one. For doing a lot of line work, if you don't have a Cintiq, it's definitely much easier to do line work with just pencils and pens on paper. Of course, if you can afford one, Cintiqs are a great investment if you do a lot of line work. Okay, so just getting the shape of this building down. Now, yes, I don't see the roof, the entire roof at least, but I can see where it starts and ends. So I'm going to do my best to pretend this is see-through and try to get the line in there. Okay, especially behind all these bushes and trees. I can try to imagine how this side looks. All right. Okay, so there's also all the foliage that's going on around this landscape, which is the next thing for me to tackle. Even though there isn't a clear divider here where the trees meets the dirt, I'm going to do my best to just simplify and make a straight line for now, just so it's easier for me to draw. And then from there, I'm going to use simple ovals and circles and organic simple shapes to break down the rest of the foliage. So this palm tree in the back, maybe just a circle, and then something like this for the trunk, so it's kind of like a lollipop shape. And the thing about shape simplification, when you're breaking down your image like this, there isn't so much a right or wrong answer. Now, a different artist might choose to break down the shapes a little bit differently. For example, with this tree here, one might choose to use only straight lines to simplify the shape. So that's one solution. Another solution might be to use just an oval, like so. Now, this exercise, you can kind of pick and choose and experiment with different shapes and see what works best for you and what you're more comfortable with. So again, it's kind of a trial and error thing, but in general, no artist is the same as another. Just as long as you're not trying to break down each little flower like such, that'll just take way too long and it doesn't help you at all with your drawing. So I'm going to go ahead and simplify these trunks. And the rest of the foliage. And just some details in the architecture that's important, like this door. And perhaps a line that can connect these details here. So instead of trying to break down each little shape in this area, there is one unifying shape in here that I can use to connect. So we can double check our work just to see how the shape simplification is working. I see that I've missed a few areas. So this foliage here, and I could probably group some of the flowers into circles. And then just kind of go back and forth to see what shapes we can edit. There are a few in here that I'm not entirely happy with yet, but it is a work in progress. So it's mainly on this side for me where I have too many things going on like this, and it's not really that simple. So what I'm going to do is actually create this into one larger shape. That simplifies it a lot easier. So that's definitely something I'm a lot happier with versus the one where it had too many stair steps going on and it just made it more complex than it needed to be. All right. And as usual, go ahead and color code the rest. And I'll most likely speed up this next section in order to just get through this demo. Continue doing this assignment until you have at least 4 done. And again, this warm up is flexible enough that you can do it either traditionally or digitally. When you are done, however, make sure you include them on a single sheet like so. You want to group them up and also label them with letters. That way it's easier for me to critique, as well as we'll be using this for a later assignment. Even though we are tracing over photos, make sure you take your time and really analyze these shapes and continue to practice what we've learned from week 1. And once you've gotten comfortable with this warm-up, you'll be ready for the next section. Chapter 2, Observation and Angles. Now that we've had some practice breaking down complex shapes and turning them into simpler ones, we're now going to put away the tracing paper and draw these from observation. For this assignment, you have several options. You can do this either traditionally with pencil and paper, or you can do this digitally as well. And in terms of actually looking at your source, I'd highly encourage you to set up the still life on a desk maybe next to you while you draw and actually look at your objects. Or you can simply use the photos you might have taken when you did the trace overs. Now I will be doing this demonstration in Photoshop. That way it's a lot easier for me to show you what I'm actually drawing and what I'm looking at the same time. But I'm going to treat it the same way as if I was doing this traditionally with the objects in front of me. Jumping straight into my demonstration, I've gone ahead and set up my canvas to be the same size as my printer paper, which is 8.5 by 11. So those of you that are doing this traditionally, you can kind of relate to the size that I'm using. I would encourage you all to try to use the whole page, but if you want to draw a little bit smaller, an acceptable size would be half the page, but I wouldn't go any smaller than that. The first thing I need to consider with my still life, since I'm not tracing it, I need to know how I want to frame the object onto my drawing. Now I need to consider whether I'm going to use a vertical or a horizontal format. So for this one, the way the objects are arranged, the bottle here is the longest and tallest object versus from the width, from the edge of this golden vase all the way to the bottle here in the glass. So if I go with a horizontal format, I might have to include more areas of the background than I really want to, or trim off the area of the bottle. But for this demo, I want to include the whole still life, so a vertical format would be the best option. Before I begin to put in my first shapes inside, I also want to consider how this is going to be fitting in the frame. So just kind of observing my still life, I'm really trying to pre-plan how this would all fit on my page and what my first shapes would be to put in. I normally prefer to start with the largest shapes or something that's really close to the edge so I know where my boundaries are. So from here, I'm going to try to gauge the top of the bottle and the bottom of the shadow and fruit as sort of my starting point because they're pretty close to the edge of the page. So for my drawing, just by looking, I'm going to mark off the top of the bottle where I think it might be located. And from there, in relation, I'll try to rough out the bottom of the fruit and the shadow. So I'm going to turn off that little guide because I will want to think about this as I'm just observing it from life. The next thing is, now that I have a starting point, I can try to find the other edges as well. So I'm looking at the golden vase and trying to find that edge in relation to the top of the bottle, which is my starting point. And I'm going to be trying to estimate and rough out this angle that I am observing. Now, to help guide myself, I can also use my pencil by holding it out in front of me at a certain angle. When you do this, you want to hold out your arm as straight as you can with your elbow locked. So just to illustrate, this might be the tip of the pencil with the eraser, and I'm trying to mark it off. And what I'm trying to do is observe where those two edges meet and try to think about the angle that it's creating. Instead of trying to say that it's a 45-degree angle, which is really hard to measure by looking, I'm gonna just think of it as a hand of a clock. So this one looks like it'll be pointing at 1 o'clock, right? Now from there, when I draw this out, I'm gonna do my best to rough out a light version of that angle and try to mark off that line. Okay. From there, I can also try to find the edge of the bottom of that vase, thinking about the angle that it's creating, roughing that out. Now from that edge to the bottom of the edge of the fruit, like so. Okay, when I'm feeling confident, I can start to put in some simple shapes. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and rough out the ball of that golden vase, and as well as the fruit that's right next to it. And then from there, I can continue to find these angles and shapes as I go along. Just like week 1, I am making dots to make it easier for myself as I block these in. Now from here, I'm observing that the bottom of that bottle is about a little more than halfway on that fruit. Now from here, I can see that the center line is somewhat touching the edge of that fruit. So that's a hidden line I could draw in on my page and rough in. So for me, it looks like I might have gone a little too long here. Just erase that out. Mark it off. At this stage, don't worry too much about trying to get it perfect. We want to do our best to rough in the shapes and we'll adjust accordingly once we have the majority of it blocked in. All right, so from here, I'm also gonna continue to find the rest of these shadows and objects. Now there is a large line here in the back that I do find important for the composition. So just kind of marking it off. And keeping those lines as straight as I can. From here, you could continue to refine some of the curves and straight lines. Make sure to not forget about the shadows as well in the background. And just a quick tip on setting up these still lifes. As much as you can, try to stick to one light source. So with my image here, all I did was set up a lamp to the left side. If you have too many light sources, you'll either have too many shadows or things will get blown out and your shadows will be a little bit harder to read. So as much as you can, keep it to one single light source, maybe something from your room or a lamp, so you can have strong shadows and clear shapes. Before moving on to categorizing my shapes, I want to double check the accuracy of my lay-in. Once I have enough shapes blocked in here, I can start using a system of lines in order to double check the accuracy of my placement. I'm going to start off with using some horizontals. And on my still life, I can try to eyeball or measure with my pencil a straight horizontal line to double check the accuracy of the bottom of the fruit with the glass bottle. I can see here that there's not a lot of negative space there, which I can then use to adjust accordingly. From there, I'm observing a straight line that there's probably a little bit more of the bottle showing through. So I need to adjust that accordingly as well. After checking some horizontals, I can also do some verticals. So from here, I can see that this vertical line to that corner, there's not that much negative space, which in this one, there's quite a bit. So I need to make an adjustment there to really showcase the amount of size for that shape. I could check a vertical shape there using my pencil. And this one's fairly good, but I can refine it a little more just to block it in a little bit more confidently. You can see that there's a shadow I missed as well. And just like we were doing earlier, you can double check some of the angles from one edge of an object to another. I'm going to put a horizontal line from the top of that vase. And I can see that observing here that it kind of runs through that curve of the label. So mine's quite off. After double checking that, I can just make that adjustment accordingly. From there, I notice I can then change the size of the bottle. And and just correct those mistakes. Besides using horizontals, verticals, and angles, we're also going to be using positive and negative shapes. So a positive shape is basically the shapes of the objects themselves, such as the circle, the rectangles, and triangles that we can find when we break these down. But the negative shapes or negative space would be the opposite of the objects themselves. So it could be the background or the space that they're occupying. And looking at that carefully, I see that my biggest mistake is the negative shape that's happening between these three objects. So from here, I notice that there's quite a bit of a rectangular shape that's going on here, where mine is more of a vertical that's going on. So since this one is way off, so I'm going to have to adjust my positive shapes and move them accordingly. Go ahead and continue to refine and measure out the angles so you can get a more accurate drawing. I've gone ahead and sped up the demonstration in order to show you how I would go about fixing my drawing. Notice how I continue to use the exercises like we did last week, drawing through with my circles and marking off sections so I can draw my curves and straight lines. Remember to keep it into simple shapes just like we did with the trace overs, using mostly rectangles, circles, ovals, triangles, keeping things in the two-dimensional realm. From here, I'm pretty satisfied with the level of work, and after you get a nice 2D block in like this, we can call it done. So for homework, I'd want you guys to do at least 4 of these drawings at about this level. Chapter 3, Editing Shape Proportions and Placement. By now, you should have plenty of shape breakdowns for you to choose from in order to do this next design assignment. As you see here, this is the type of work you would have done based on the previous 2 chapters. I have the traceover samples to the left, as well as the observational lay-ins to the right. So I want you to choose 2 of your favorite breakdowns, and we'll be doing several iterations based on what we've learned so far. We're going to strategically place objects or change their sizes in order to create a better composition with certain restrictions. So from the drawings I did, I went ahead and chose A and number 4 respectively. Now from here, I want you to put away all your references and images and just have the line drawing with the simple shapes showing. In order to do this correctly, we want to make sure we put our references away in order to do this assignment properly. The main thing about the kind of editing I want you all to do is similar to what we did last week with the design assignment and doing thumbnails with different shapes. But instead of just going with our gut feelings, we're actually going to have design goals and certain restrictions. So we're going to be editing 2 things. We are going to be editing size by making something bigger or smaller. We're also going to be editing placement. Okay. What we are not editing is what we are not doing is changing the shape. Okay. So we are only changing the size, the relative placement, but not the shape itself. Now that we've gotten some of the rules out of the way, we're going to start talking about the design goals. We're going to do 3 different iterations, and each one will have a very specific goal. So for the first 2 design goals, you're going to pick a specific focal point from the image that you chose. Now it's up to you which shape you want to choose, just as long as the first and the second one are different. So it's up to you to fill in this blank. For the first one, I'm going to go ahead and pick the triangle. From there, I really want to think about how I want to make that my focal point. So when I sketch out my thumbnail, I might have to recrop and also even think about the aspect ratio I'm going to use. Since the triangle is a pretty tall object, I will think about using a more vertical, just like in the previous demo. Okay, so from here, I'm going to place it closer to center, a little bit to the right, and make sure it takes up as much as the page as possible. Now from there, I'm going to have the box shape that's off to the side, that's quite cropped off, as well as the circle. Now from here, I have a little bit of an issue where the circle and the triangle kind of take the same amount of stage presence because they're both not cropped off the same way that the box shape is. So what I'm going to do is move it more to the left and even increase its size just so most of it is cropped off to the edge. Now from there, I'm going to include that part of the background and just clean up my image. So as you see here, unlike the other 2 shapes, the triangle is taking up most of the image. So for me, this is working pretty well, and I'm pretty satisfied with achieving my design goal. So pretty simple. All right, so the next one, let's go ahead and pick a different shape. Now remember, the shadows are also a shape that we broke down, and I'm actually going to pick one of those. So I'm going to pick the shadow of the circle. Again, this one is way to the left, and I'm really going to have to recrop my image quite a bit. So from here, I want to make sure it takes up a good amount of space. As I continue to draw the circle, sometimes it's best to even draw outside of the frame just to get a better sense of the shape. So that one went a little bit too large, maybe around there. Because whether you're doing this in pencil or Photoshop, it's really easy to clean up your image. Okay, so from here, just like in the previous one where the circle was kind of competing with the triangle, and this one the shadow in the back is competing a little bit with the shadow for the circle. So what I'm going to do is completely trim that line out and increase the size of that shadow. So that way, if this were to turn into a painting, I have these 2 large shapes, which is the circle and the shadow in the back here. But this one feels a little bit more complete while the rest is cropped off. So for me, this one feels a lot more important and definitely becomes the focal point. For this third and final goal, we are going to do something a bit different. So as you see here, the sentence is more about feeling. Unlike these two, which is filling in the noun or the what, we are really starting to think about the emotion and how we want our audience to feel. So for this one, it can be a little bit more challenging and it might take a little bit more time than just picking a shape. So if you need to, take a look at a thesaurus or maybe listen to some music on how you want this image to come out. For this demonstration, I'm going to be using the word heaviness in order to describe the feeling I want to evoke. You could use either a noun or an adjective to fill in the blank here. Now, when I think of something that feels heavy, usually most of the weight is on top. If you can imagine carrying something with a lot of force, usually things will feel like they're toppling over or something's over your head. Now, this is a bit more abstract, but this is also where things get pretty fun. So for this one, what I'm going to do is try to be really careful with my placement and how I'm going to crop this image. From here, I'm going to place all these objects on the top end to make it feel top heavy and keep the bottom area a lot lighter. So from here, I'm going to really try to clutter the top area here with these shapes. Again, drawing outside the frame so I can get a better sense of where things are in relation to each other. And then from there, just cleaning it up. So as you see here, what I did was really put all my objects on the top of this frame and leave the bottom area empty. It kind of feels top heavy, where if this was all lit with if this was all lit in a painting, this would feel pretty dark and heavy on top, where the bottom wouldn't be rendered out so much. And from there, you'll have 3 designs, just changing the placement, framing, and sizes and proportion of these shapes. All right, so we're finally in the last demonstration here, and I've decided to go ahead and drink a ton of coffee in order to get through it a lot quicker. So this is me drawing in real time, not holding back, and just having a ton of fun. Joking aside, this is the same approach where you want to take your time and really pick your goals for your designs here. And as you can see, I've decided to choose the landscape. And the biggest challenge was the type of shapes. So it's a lot more complex than the still life. So you'll see me here struggling just a bit on deciding what shapes to use, because I didn't want to change the shape so much like I mentioned earlier. I want to just change the size and placement. So in the background, I was stretching it out as much as I can without losing the integrity of the shapes. And just like that, that will wrap up week 2. I hope you found this design assignment fun, like I did. Just remember to try your best when designing these shapes and moving them around. And the thing with design is it's all problem solving. As long as you have a clear goal in mind, there might be several solutions to that problem. There isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer here. Just give it your best shot. Just be patient, and I know this might be very new to a lot of people. Even though this is a beginner course, I feel like it's really important that we flex our design muscles and really use our creative freedom as much as we can. With that in mind, keep up the hard work, and I'll see you on the next one. All right, so just a quick overview for this week's homework. For the first section, you will be doing the trace over breakdowns, and I want at least 4 minimum. Whether you're doing this with pencil or in Photoshop, I want you to include the image either next to the line work or underneath it, like this. For the observational breakdowns, again, also 4 minimum at least. And you want to include the image that you're looking at. So just take a photo with your phone or any kind of camera you have. The image of the photograph doesn't have to be so high quality. I just need to know what you were looking at in order to assess your breakdowns. And lastly, you'll be turning in the design assignment where you pick 2 of your breakdowns from before and try to do 3 different iterations based on your design goals. Again, all of these assignments can be done strictly traditionally or digitally, or you could try a little bit of both. However, I do want you to present this and organize this nicely, like I shown here, with the images next to it, like so. That way, it'll be easy to see the kind of drawings that you were breaking down. If the images aren't included with it, then it'll be really hard for me to assess what you were looking at. All right, well, good luck this week, and let me know if you have any questions.